The subject we're going to be talking about is blinded. Back in 2007, about midway through 2007, I had an opportunity. I was headhunted out of the company I was working for and had an opportunity to begin working for a company that some of you may know called Countrywide Financial. This was basically unbeknownst to me as I headhunted into this company about 6 months before chaos was fixing to happen. Going into a company, they were offering significant and generous pay raises as they were bringing people over. They were not bashful about spending any of the money that they had coming in. And I took this job, and basically, I was working in IT and technology, so I was kind of insulated for what many of you now know about with the collapse of the housing market and everything that happened with the financial institutions and the chaos that happened in our country around that. It's amazing looking back on it now that there were factors that you could see, but at the time, you couldn't. And there's a lot of debate even still today, was this naivety on behalf of the people who were doing some of these things? Was it pure greed? Was it people just falling on this complacency idea? Many people talked about over and over that, well, there's never been, a condition where the housing market would just collapse like that people would walk away from their homes, not even caring to pay their bills. And so maybe there was a complacency there. The interesting thing, though, is that as you go back, and if you've ever researched it, I can suggest to you a couple of movies or documentaries that are pretty good to watch, that are pretty accurate. The idea that they were turning a blind eye because surely that can't happen. The money's so good. The money's so good. And all of these things that were happening eventually led to a lot of heartache and grief for a lot of Americans, especially in the middle class. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight with blinded is the idea of, again, it's going to be not seeing, but not in the idea of a physical blindness, but about our spiritual lives and how we can potentially become spiritually blinded, or those that we're talking to may be spiritually blinded. I don't have 3 words for you. Sorry if you're taking notes. If you want to take a note, you can take a note every time you hear the word blind and see. That will pretty much do it. Common vernacular, we see it so often in the English language about everyday things, that the idea of being intellectually inept or not understanding or not being able to perceive what actually is going on. See it all the time. The idea of flying blind. Pilot in his plane loses instrumentation, maybe in the middle of the night. He has no radar, whatever. At that point, he's flying blind. He doesn't have any outside information coming in. He has nothing to check against of what he's doing. The idea of like blind luck, that you had no happenstance, it just happened to you. You couldn't see it coming. You had no idea what would happen. Blind rage, you may have heard of this. A person who can't control themselves, and in a moment of pure being angry, they might fly off in the idea of a blind rage. They had no control over it. Probably heard of this, a blind taste test. See it? A lot of commercials about you don't know what the factors are, you just get to participate, and at that point you can vote on what's the best. Blindsided. There was a lot of people back in 2008 that were blindsided. The idea that you didn't see it coming. And over and over and over again, we see this in our common everyday language. Blinded by greed, blinded by hate, blinded by prejudice, blinded by love. We do all of these things out of these temporal and actually not using our brains to actually see and gather the facts. So when it comes to spiritual, My stuff is a little off here on the formatting. So when it comes to spiritual, I want to start talking about some things that could be why. Why would I be blinded? What would cause it when it comes to being spiritually blind? Possibly priorities. If you have certain priorities about, you know what, I'm really trying to advance my job, I really want to do a certain amount of things, it may cause you to make decisions about whether you take a certain job, whether you're traveling all the time, whether you're willing to maybe skirt the rules on a few things because of what your company is demanding and how you treat people. And there's a lot of things that we can do around our priorities, you know. Is it really awesome that my kid is a great football player, baseball player, and all of this stuff, and, you know, we want to get him into possibly the best college. So, you know what, we're going to go do, you know, private lessons, and those happen to be on Wednesday night, so we're going to put away maybe Bible study. Priorities can have a big effect on us in being spiritually blind. Pride. This one affects a lot of us. Pride being the idea of, I know what's right, or I know what I should be doing, or I know that maybe I'm walking in a manner of sin, and not being willing to accept it, to actually see it, to push it off to the side and say, no, not me, or no, I'm not willing to make this change, or whatever it could be. Maybe it's the actual sin we're living in, that we have to now face this and face its consequences if we're going to say, yeah, this is actually sinful, that we're not trying to make excuses for it anymore, that we're living in that kind of life, and so we have to deal with that. Fear. Fear can drive us to do a lot of things. There are a great number of people in here tonight that I know of personally that had to make some pretty hard choices. And to not be spiritually blind, to resist whatever fear of the things that may come. The fear of maybe what your family may say. The fear of the relationships that are strained. The fear of what am I going to potentially miss out on. Fear can have a heavy, heavy effect on us on being blinded. I talked about complacency earlier. Hey, I grew up in the church. I've heard all the lessons. I know all there is to do to it. I don't have to study so much. You know, I'm not a new convert. It's an easy way to eventually let things that can creep in because we're not doing that kind of study. False teachings. False teachings can be when we're not being prepared, that complacency idea again, being prepared to understand what is accurate and what is not, that we don't actually see. Maybe it's even something that, man, what they're saying sounds pretty good to me. You know, I would like that to be the case, and so maybe I'm just going to accept that as truth versus the actual idea of I'm investigating it. All of those are potential causes, but what it gets down to is being able to say, even if I was spiritually blind, how can I know? Because I'm blinded to it, right? What do I need to do to help me get through that? Psalm 119:18. If you want to follow along and read, I'll have most of these scriptures up before we get to one of the points I want to make in Acts, but Psalm 119:18-19. Open my eyes that I may see wondrous things from your law. I am a stranger in the earth. Do not hide your commandments from me. This is a song, essentially a prayer to God. Prayer is the one way that we can be honestly striving, trying to tell God, God, help me see my flaws. Help me see where I'm wrong. Help me see where I'm deficient on something. Help me understand what it is you would have me to do to rightfully divide your word. I don't want to go off my wisdom, God. I want to use yours, and I need you to help impart that upon me. Help me see it. So prayer would be one of them. Another one, example in Acts 17:10-11. The brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. These, talking about the Bereans, were far more minded than those in Thessalonica. in that they received the word with all readiness, and they searched the scripture daily to find out whether these things were so. Our study is really where you're also going to be, if you're intellectually being honest with yourself and saying, am I seeing what I need to see? Am I blinding myself? Am I going into a study with I would like, God, for you to be saying this to me. Now I'm going to sit down and try to figure out how to make that so. Or are we saying, God, I am a clay pot in your hand. Mold me. Tell me, show me in your word what it is that I'm to do. And I had a little notation here on my slide that says, am I being a Berean? And that's really what it comes down to is, are you really willing to, when you hear something, maybe it's something that it's somebody you respect and have known for a long, long time, and they said something that was a little bit off. It could have been an accidental thing. It could not have been. It could have been something that they are now pushing or believe, and you need to make sure that these things are true. You need to make sure that you are following along studying as well. Acts 18, 24 through 26. Now, a certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria, an eloquent man, mighty in scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the baptism of John. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. The question is also, am I willing to hear that I'm wrong? Am I willing to be humble enough in that study, in that prayer, to say, I don't know. I don't know all the things. God, help me. Or maybe it's a brother or sister that comes to you and says, I see this in you. I don't think it's the normal that I've seen in you. Can I talk to you about it? Maybe it's something that you're slipping on. Are you ready to receive it? That's kind of hard because we all want to think that we've got everything together all the time. One of my favorites, Acts 8, 27 through 31. So he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians. And take note of that. Great authority under Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, who had charge of all her treasury, had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning. And sitting in his chariot, he was reading Isaiah the prophet. Then the Spirit said to Philip, go near, overtake this chariot. So Philip ran to him. And he heard him reading the prophet Isaiah and said, do you understand what you're reading? And his reply, how can I unless someone guides me? And he asked Philip to come up and sit with him. A man who was not lacking in intellectual capability. Think about his position. Think about the authority that he had there. In charge of all the treasury underneath Queen of the Ethiopians. And yet, he didn't hesitate under the fact he desired to know when Philip came to him and said, do you understand what you're reading? How can I? But someone show me, guide me. I think that's hard for us too. I think it's hard for us to often admit that something doesn't make sense. That you know what, I've studied this and I've gone down this way and I've been thinking it was this all along, and now I'm thinking it's this, and now I'm getting myself wrapped in this circle and going around and around, and I don't really know what it is that I need to do. Putting together, if you ever put together a lesson or something like a woman's teaching night or anything it is, you can rabbit hole on quite a few things. Imagine doing that on something of study that you're working on that is of a scriptural concern in nature. That people that you know, known for years and years and years, are maybe presenting something that you don't believe that's what the Bible is telling you. And so you're trying to listen to their arguments about it and trying to rightfully divide it, and where that can go. If our pride's kicking in and we think we know it all, that hurts us. That makes us spiritually blind. It makes us not want to actually see what God wants to tell us. And that maybe that God's telling you that you're wrong. That what you've had this belief all along is maybe not been accurate. So with all of that, my desire tonight is to go through some of Acts 24 through 26. I'm not going to read every single verse, but I'm not going to not read a lot of them. The idea here with going through this was looking one at Paul, and then when he's arrested, that he has to be brought forward before Felix and then eventually Festus and King Agrippa. And I want to go through this with this mindset of all of these men at some point or another have turned a blind eye to something when it comes to the gospel. Started with Saul when he eventually became Paul. But I'm going to read through this. We're going to be in verse 24 to start, and I'll try to make sure I call out when I'm reading verses. In verse 24, this is after he's been sent to Caesarea, and he's going to face his accusers. So if you want to read along with me, I'm going to read starting in verse 2 of chapter 24. And when he was called upon, Tertullus, this is a orator that has come with the elders and those of the Jewish eldership, the men there that are bringing these accusations against Paul. Tertullus began his accusation saying, and this is him talking to Felix here, seeing that though or through you we enjoy great peace and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. This guy's slick. It's the reason why he was an orator. You see it right there. Think about being in that seat of judgment already. Felix is like, yes, I am all these things, aren't I? Immediately, you have a chance by taking pride to turn a blind eye to what truth may be coming. Interesting. And so from there, Tertullus goes on and he gives some of the information out about the charges that they're bringing. He says in verse 5, for we found this man a plague, a creator of dissension. He also talks about that he is a ringleader. Interesting choice of words. We try to use triggering words, right? He's the ringleader. Talks about he's the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Again, those are interesting kind of words to utilize, right? He's looking for an effect. He's using that, trying to influence. And we wanted to judge him according to our laws, but the guardians or the guards came in, took him by violence from our hands. Okay, so go on to verse 10. We're going to pick up there. So he's been accused. This is what's going on. And so Felix basically gives Paul a chance. Okay, let's hear what you have to say. Paul, after the governor had nodded to him, speak and answered, insomuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do more cheerfully answer for myself. Because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting a crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city, nor can they prove of these things which they now accuse me. But at this I confess to you that according to the way, which they call a sect, and the way would be the gospel of Christ, I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, but that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself strive to have conscience without offense toward God and men. So he's basically telling them, look, they're basically upset because I'm talking about the resurrection of man. That's what it comes down to. I'm not in there inciting riots and stirring up the pot and causing a lot of commotion. They're saying that because they just don't like what I'm saying. We've already seen that happen with Jesus himself. It's the same thing. It was what he said. It wasn't how he said it. It wasn't what he was doing. It goes on where he starts talking about his past there, that where he had been teaching beforehand and that no one had come with these kind of accusations. Picking up in verse 22. So when Felix heard these things, having a more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will make a decision on your case. So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul, to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for him or to visit him. So not forbidding any of his friends to see him or to bring any sustenance or anything to him. Probably not necessarily because he's now believing necessarily all of Paul and understanding the way more, but probably more to the idea is that Paul is a Roman citizen. So he's giving him probably some of that courtesy because he hasn't really necessarily heard anything yet that is truly, without doubt, hey, I'm going to make a decision against this man that they're bringing the accusations. So picking up in 24. So after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, important note here, we're going to see it a little bit. Drusilla is actually the sister of King Agrippa. So we'll talk about King Agrippa in a little bit, but just notate that connection there. She, with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, which is an interesting note about understanding a little more. Okay, that maybe that's the reason why Felix understood already a little bit of the way. He's already had eyesight of this. He sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix was afraid. And you have to ask yourself, I wonder why. What was he afraid of? Was he afraid of, I don't want to have to believe, using my sight, not being blinded, to what the truth here is, and having this riot of people upon my hands? The same people who rioted and basically forced the decisions that would lead to Jesus being executed. He says, Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. That feels like a very heavy response. And I dare to say maybe half of us in this room have had that response about something spiritual in our lives. Go away, I'm gonna deal with this later. It's too heavy for me to deal with. Turn a blind eye to it. It could be your decision alone to follow Jesus and be baptized, knowing that maybe by your making that choice, you're making an inference and judgment on family, on friends, on other people that may be in your life. But it's interesting that he chooses those words. So he actually also hopes that he's going to start getting bribed. And this goes on for a couple of years, that he just kind of keeps him at arm's length. Okay? Almost, I don't want to think that he forgot about him. I just think he just kind of didn't want to deal with it. He put it aside. In that 2 years, what happens now is Festus comes in and takes over this position. And now basically Felix is like, thank you, and dumps it all on his lap. Okay? So, the Jews are not going to waste this opportunity to immediately go to Festus and say, hey, we haven't had any resolution here. There's a guy we've got charges against, Paul, he's in your prisons. Let's get this dealt with. They're ready to kill him. They're plotting. They're trying to figure out, hey, you just figure out how you're going to transfer him back to Jerusalem, and we'll kill him on the way. We'll hide on the side of the road, and we'll kill him on the way. We'll take it out of your hands. That's the point where they're at. They're so blinded to the words of Jesus and to what Paul is now preaching that's their response. So eventually, Festus, he's brought before him, and Festus wants to hear what has to be said, and he's going to listen to the same thing. And basically, Festus is like, look, why don't we send you up to Jerusalem, and we will judge you there? And Paul's like, no, I don't need to go up there. I appeal to Caesar. Put me in front of him. Let him make that choice. Let him judge me. Paul already knew from a while back from the Holy Spirit talking to him that he was going to eventually be in Rome. That's where he was desiring to get to. So Festus agrees to this for now. He's like, okay, well, if you want to appeal to Caesar, then to Caesar you're going to go. That's what's going to happen. During this time, after a few days while Paul is waiting, nothing's happened at this point. He's still in Caesarea. King Agrippa and Bernice also is the sister of King Agrippa. Context that we see in history says that might be an incestuous relationship, but she and King Agrippa are there, and they're coming to greet Festus, maybe just being in the area. They had been there for quite a few days, and now Festus is like, okay, so this got dumped in my lap. I want to dump it in yours. He's like, I have this situation. I have this man who's been accused, but I can't really find anything wrong that he's deserving of the death that they're demanding. Okay? Picking up in verse 14. So when they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there's a certain man left, a prisoner by Felix. So first of all, this is not my problem, but I'm just having to deal with it, so don't blame me. About whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews have informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for judgment against him. To them I answered, is it not the custom of Romans to deliver any man not to destruction, to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets accusers face to face, and that he has an opportunity to answer for himself concerning charges against him. So therefore, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment, and I commanded he be brought forward, and he stood up, and they brought no accusation against him of such things, I suppose, but had questions about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died. So he's basically saying they really don't have accusations. They're just asking questions about their religion. That's how much he's kind of brushing it off. And because I was uncertain of the questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and be judged there, and he appealed for a decision to be reserved by Augustus, and I commanded him to be kept until he could be sent to Caesar. And Agrippa said to Festus, I would also like to hear this man for myself. So it'd be interesting to know if he's also heard some of this is going around. We know his sister probably did. Okay, it's interesting. And so Festus says, tomorrow you shall hear him. And so the next day, with a lot of pomp and circumstance, Agrippa and Bernice come forward. They bring Paul in to be able to basically give a chance to speak to Agrippa about this. And during this time, when Agrippa says you're permitted to speak, we start seeing Paul go through the recounting of his conversion, where he actually was physically blind, and it took a big ordeal moment to actually get his attention of the spiritual blindness that he already had. We know all of what Saul's exploits were in the early Christians, in that early church, of what he was doing in killing, and what he was doing in basically chasing everyone even who fled from him. It says that he went after them even into foreign cities. He did so what he thought, his blind eye, he thought, was what it was expected of him. After he goes through and gives all of this information and talks about his post-conversion life, about his preaching, about going to all of these cities to spread this news, and he tells them, let's pick up in verse 22 of chapter 26. Therefore, having obtained help from God, to this day I stand witnessing both to small and great, that no other things than those which the prophets and Moses said would come, that the Christ would suffer, that he would be the first to rise from the dead, would proclaim light to the Jewish people and to Gentiles. And as he made this defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you're beside yourself. Much learning is driving you mad. That was Festus' blind eye. That's the way to treat it. I don't want to hear this, so I'm just going to say, claim you're crazy. Okay? Paul defends himself that he was very much not so, that he spoke from the words of truth and reason. And he said to the king, he said, "For I am convinced none of these things escape your attention. And none of this was done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe." And then Agrippa said something to Paul even more earth-shattering. "You almost persuade me to become a Christian." Spiritual blindness can affect us in so many ways. It affected all three of these men in a certain way. Paul was the one who was able to receive sight, his spiritual sight. It took a big happening, though. It took a big incident to get his attention. Sometimes when we are preaching the truth, the person who wants to turn a blind eye like Festus did, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. Second Corinthians 4, verse 3 through 4, even if our gospel is veiled or hidden, it's veiled to those who are perishing, whose minds the God of this age has blinded, who do not believe, lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine on them. And so we start asking ourselves, if we are blinded, how can we actually overcome that? We've luckily found a way that we now see. We see that we've been blinded in this. Now, what do we need to do to change? Everything is summarized in that. Every one of those items about your priorities, your fears, your uncertainties, your desires for certain chasing of things of this world, every single one of those, fact of the matter, are selfish ambitions. They're selfish in nature. And Jesus taught us exactly how to be right with God. Not my will, Lord, but yours. And so when we go to prayer and when we go into studies and when we go in those things that can help us find out if are we being spiritually blind or are we actually seeing, if this is the mindset in your heart, you'll see it. You'll be able to see it if there's a place where you're falling. Tonight, if anybody has either one of these type of phrases that is affecting you, I implore and plead with you that you make it right. The idea that it's not convenient for you right now just means that you don't want to face it. Please don't let it be a big event that has to gain your attention, that maybe I should pay more attention to these things. Not too long ago, I was watching some of the documentaries about some of the things that happened with people with 9/11 and how it affected their lives and the people that survived and how many that didn't. There could have been people that day that were in a situation of it's not convenient time for me to deal with. You almost persuaded me. You almost persuaded me to change all of these things about my life, to deal with all of these things, but it's just not convenient time. I don't want that to be the case for anyone here. If that potentially is the case and you'd like to make it right, you have an opportunity. We're going to sing an invitation song. And even if it's just prayers, that you will be able to go into your studies, that you will be able to go into observing for yourself, being accurate, not being hesitant, not being too prideful, like the Ethiopian eunuch. I don't think I know it all. I'm okay you guiding me. I'm okay with that. That you can make that known, that you have that same kind of courage that will allow you to truly answer this question, are you blinded? And that's what I'll leave with you tonight. I hope that this was encouraging to you, and that I hope that if there's anything we can help you with, that you'll let that be known as we stand and we sing.